Hello testers and welcome to another STP community webinar. My name is James, I'm the event coordinator here at STP, and we're excited to have everyone on the webinar today. Ryan Horesco is joining us from Lincoln, Nebraska, and he'll be talking about testing cookie consent and how you can test across many languages and browsers, so stick around. A few things to go over before we get started today. Coming this summer, the Mile High Software Testing Conference in Denver, Colorado. The in-person event will take place over 2 days and will include a mix of 3-hour in-depth workshops, 90-minute sessions, and 45-minute breakout talks. The event will consist of all things testing, including agile, automation, mobile, accessibility, artificial intelligence, strategy, and everything in between. So if you're ready to take your testing experience to the next level, join us July 27th and 28th for the Mile High Software Testing Conference in Denver. Visit milehighTesting.com to learn more and register for the in-person conference. Starting next week, how to build a successful automation framework with BDD in mind with Thomas Haber. Join Thomas in this 2-day virtual workshop where attendees will learn how to write automated scenarios, handle test data, implement continuous integration with Jenkins, create standards around test development, and ultimately build a test automation framework capable of supporting behavior-driven development. The virtual workshop will take place over 2 days, next Wednesday, June 9th, and the following Wednesday, June 16th, from noon to 4 p.m. Eastern. Visit SoftwareTestPro.com to learn more about and register for Thomas's workshop. Also backed by popular demand, STP is bringing you the Essential Patterns of Mature Agile Testers workshop with Bob Galen and Sean Bradshaw. The 2-day virtual workshop explores the practices and mindset of fully empowered Agile testers on high-performance Agile teams, and Bob and Sean will share with you real-world tactics that will help you guide your team towards higher performance. The workshop takes place on Monday and Tuesday, June 28th and 29th, and seating is limited, so be sure to visit SoftwareTestPro.com to reserve your spot today. A reminder that our next scheduled webinar is on June 30th from Vishnu Murthy, where he goes into depth about distributed workload generator testing and how the solution is playing a crucial role in delivering servers validation efforts. Be sure to visit SoftwareTestPro.com to register for this webinar and check out other webinars coming up later this year. Looking to practice your speaking and presentation skills or have an idea for a webinar topic? STP is looking for both new and veteran speakers and is currently filming the second half of the 2021 community webinar schedule. So submit your proposal today at SoftwareTestPro.com. And if you're on social media and talking about today's webinar, be sure to tag us at SoftwareTestPro and use the hashtag STP Webinar. And with that, please welcome Ryan. We're excited to have you on our community webinar schedule, and the floor is all yours.
All right, thank you, James. Let me share my screen here. All right. Yeah, it looks like my screen's sharing all right. Yeah, first I just wanted to say thank you to James and Software Test Professionals for allowing me to speak at this webinar. It's on a topic that I'm obviously passionate about. So hopefully you take away at least something that's valuable for you at the end of this. But yeah, just to kick things off here, the title of this is Testing Cookie Consent for the Web in Multiple Languages. And when I say cookie consent, that also includes things like third-party scripts and iframes that might be loaded on a web application as well. I'm a senior QA engineer at Osano, and basically what Osano is, we are a startup specializing in data privacy. There's a lot of different aspects to data privacy, things like data subject access requests, for example, but today we're going to focus more on the cookie consent. So those banners that you see when you load up a web page at the bottom, right, that asks you to accept or deny cookies, and then storage preferences as well. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and we'll get started. But first, I wanted to sort of just give you a look at Osano by the numbers. And the reason why this is important is it helps give some context as to why automated testing, which I'll go into, automated testing in multiple languages and trying to test at scale is really important, because we're trying to operate at a really large scale. So Osana was founded in 2018 by Arlo Gilbert and Scott Hertel. It's based in Austin, Texas. We're on over 750,000 websites, which is pretty big for us being a startup. And then more importantly, we support over 42 languages. Several months ago, this was at about 35 or 36. So we're consistently adding more and more languages as we expand globally and around the world. And the one cool stat that I think is cool is we process over 120 million consents per month so far. That's obviously going to increase. But basically what that means is that when a user lands on a web page, they see a cookie consent banner and they accept all essential cookies, for example, we record that as a consent. So that also highlights the importance of what we're going to talk about today, which is testing cookie consent in multiple languages and ultimately trying to achieve as much coverage as we possibly can using different tools. So just as an example, I'm not going to read through what's in the UI here specifically, but when I talk about a cookie consent banner at the bottom of this screen, you can see an example of what that might be. This is our own from Osano, but these come in different variations, obviously, where you have the description and really telling the user what happens if you remain on this website, along with a cookie policy link. But we also are going to talk about the storage preferences option. These are typically viewable after you've consented, and then you can open up, for example, a preferences drawer like this one here, and you can see all the different text associated with the different classifications like essential, marketing, personalization, analytics, and anything in between, along with the cookie notice options. Basically, that's telling a user what cookies are disclosed in your current browsing session as you land on a certain web page. But like I said, today we're focused on consenting for cookies and scripts and iframes. It's not the kind of cookies that you eat, but this is our main focus today. So to set the stage, I just wanted to talk about some of the key data points that go into the testing strategy that we're going to talk through. So there's three primary resources that we're going to discuss, and I'm sure a lot of you know what these are. You have a lot of experience with them, but they're scripts, cookies, and they're iframes. These are pretty fundamental to a lot of different web applications and a lot of different websites. You can see what scripts are loaded usually just by going into Chrome DevTools, for example, and in the HTML, in the head of the page, you can see what scripts are loaded. An example of a script is jQuery. That's a third-party script that's often loaded, along with any third-party vendor scripts that a website might require for, payment systems or tracking or analytics, or, they're loading a form onto a page, right? There's a lot of different variations of that, but that's an important resource to consider because it's ultimately what a user will consent to when they run into a cookie consent solution or a banner. The next one is cookies, right? It's one that we're familiar with. Cookies are often used to make your web browsing experience better, but it's important that those are disclosed to an end user as they're browsing the web and as they're on certain websites. And you can often see these, once again, Chrome DevTools. You go into console or network rather, and then you can see in session storage or local storage what kind of cookies are being classified. And then there's iframes, right? These are the resources that are integral to loading. You want to load an embedded YouTube video or a video from Vimeo, or maybe there's an iframe used in the HTML to display a job application form, right? So iframes are also part of the classification process. But the next step is taking those resources. Ultimately, they're classified in the world of consent and data privacy. They can be classified into four primary categories, and these are important for testing to understand as well, because they each have different implications. There's what we call essential classifications. So that means that a web application owner or someone who runs a website and they have a consent management solution in place for their cookie banners and their storage preferences, they decide, okay, what's essential for this website to load and what's essential to give our customers and users an optimal experience. So that's one of the classification buckets. But there's also marketing, right? We see ads all the time. So there might be certain scripts for advertising that are loaded onto a web page, and they're classified in a marketing bucket. These are not necessarily as important typically as essential classifications, but they are important to a lot of different businesses out there who have their own website. Personalization, right? That's another category. And then, analytics. We're all familiar with different analytics tracking services or third-party libraries like Google Analytics, for example. Not saying that these classifications and having all these scripts are good or bad, but the reality is that in order for consent to work properly and for us to test properly, we need to know what these classifications are and where iframes, scripts, and cookies ultimately fall into these different categories. So just from a more technical standpoint, when we're looking at the HTML, and this comes in handy when we're trying to actually write test cases using a framework like Cypress or Selenium or whatever the case may be. The top example here is an example of a source, just loading a JS file. Maybe on an iframe, it's got a source, but we're also trying to set the width and the height and the overflow settings as well. And then there's an example of what setting a cookie on the web page and in the HTML might look like. So that's a technical representation of the previous two slides as well. But ultimately, what gets me excited is I'm a huge fan of testing at scale. It's something I really enjoy, and it's a hard problem to solve. It's not easy, and we're still learning a lot. Here at Osano and as a QA engineering team, how to best do this. But late Q3 last year, we would execute a lot of manual test cases, and we were able to cover a lot of ground. But ultimately, it takes a lot of time, especially being a startup, to round up all the resources to manually test all these different combinations in 40 plus different languages with different translations and whatnot. So I'm sort of showing the end result here near the beginning of the presentation, because it sort of sets the stage that why it's important that we implemented things the way that we did. So I started asking questions as I was trying to test in multiple languages and scale these efforts. Like, how do we scale, right? It's a very broad question. It's a question that comes up in engineering in general, but it's also important in engineering quality assurance or quality engineering as well. So we rely on several tools, like a lot of different engineers rely on. So we actually use a framework called Cypress. I'm sure many of you have heard of it or are using it, or maybe you're experts with Cypress. I don't claim to be an expert, but I do think it's been fundamental for us in terms of efficiently testing the front end UI interactions and functionally testing what we need for these different cookie consent banners and storage preferences combinations. Cypress does a really good job of making things visual, providing a way to write a test and get immediate feedback on that testing loop. So it's been huge for us. They have an awesome API, a lot of great documentation. But that's just the framework. Continuous integration is a big part of what we do and what we're trying to scale ultimately. Obviously, continuous integration is sort of a buzzword. It's been around for a long time. Since for the past 10 years or so, it's been a big topic, right? But it's fundamental in terms of not just running a test manually or not just running your tests locally, but how do we get it into a continuous integration environment so we can run nightly test runs against our entire regression suite for consent banners and all the different storage preferences options. And then we also use Browser Stack, right? Another popular tool. It's been awesome in terms of scaling our browser coverage 5 or 10x, which is big in terms of confidence, right? We can be confident that we can run against a headless version of Chrome, but it increases our confidence almost 5-fold if we can run against multiple different versions of browsers and whatnot. So that's sort of the approach to scaling our testing efforts. Oops, went back one here. But then the next big question is how do we test all supported languages? The internet's global now, so we can't just have consent banners that work in English, right? And as we're testing, it's extremely important that we can achieve that coverage, because the alternative is a lot of manual testing using different VPN solutions to sort of simulate, a translation in Spanish or Portuguese or German, for example. So I'll run through some examples of cookie banners and what they look like, and just from a from a QA perspective, I like to see things visually and understand that, from a UI perspective, how can we break things down? So as you can see here, it might look complicated or somewhat daunting. You see this entire cookie banner and you're thinking, well, how do I test this? And what's the approach that I should take? But ultimately, this breaks down very similar to how an entire web page might break down, right? You can break it down into sections. Up top, we've got the main description, what it means to consent to different combinations of marketing, personalization, and analytics. Another separate component is the data storage policy link. And then beneath that, you've got the toggles and the different classification options. And then we've got two different buttons that do two different things. So that's an example of a cookie consent banner. But then another big challenge is, right, we've got to support right to left languages. And this is a perfect example of that, right? I can't read this language, but I know that we need to translate it properly. And I know that it needs to display right to left instead of left to right, like we might see in English or in Spanish. So accommodating for that in not only our feature set and our UI, but when we're testing with something like Cypress, that sort of throws another wrench into the fold that we need to consider. This has all the same UI components as the previous example. It's just in a different language, and we're displaying it slightly different, and the toggles are flipped, much like this one as well. So as a quick example, right, like we can, using Cypress, there might be a tag in our UI that's specifying right to left, and we can get that, make sure it exists, and then we can ultimately run all the other assertions, which I'll dive into later, actually testing those languages as well. But what also made this challenging is testing multiple configurations. And what that means is there's different configurations that a customer could display their banner as, right? It can be more permissive, meaning they're going to be more liberal with the content that they load in front of the user up front. There's options that are more strict, so they allow the user to, you can select, whether you want marketing or analytics cookies to be tracked, or you can deselect them, or you can accept all, or there's different configurations in terms of what part of the world that you live in. There's different data privacy regulations, whether you're here in the US or maybe over in Europe. There's a lot of different moving parts to this. And as testers and as a QA engineer, it's important for me to consider that. So an example is, this looks a bit different than the other ones, right? So I think when I first started tackling this problem and trying to figure out how to automate all of this, you see another combination, right? We've got this storage toggle over on the left-hand side. There's the storage preferences and third parties, hyperlinks. It's a little dark, sorry about that. But ultimately has the same save and accept all buttons, but it has different text within the banner as well. So ultimately what this comes down to is understanding that we're dealing with a UI here, right? In a sense, there's nothing special. So ultimately we're trying to simplify the problem, right? So in terms of simplifying the problem, right, how do we do that? Well, visually, like we mentioned before, break it down, right? Ultimately, there are 7 different sections here, and these are going to flow into native JSON, right? We're all familiar with JSON and sort of the key value pairs that exist within a JSON file. Ultimately, if you break it down, and we can put all these into their own JSON file, and then pull those values into our test suite, and then we can assert against those values. So we're not trying to assert against an entire element, and we're not treating this as an entire element. Ultimately, we want to break it down into sections. And this is sort of the approach that we took along the way. So as a slight recap, this isn't the end of the presentation, but just before we head into some more technical examples, once again, there's 2 main components here. There are storage preferences, right? On the left-hand side, we have two of the same banner here, right? Left-hand side, there is the English version, and the right-hand side, there is a version of Spanish. Once again, highlighting the importance that all of the fundamental UI components are the same, but we need to handle different languages as well. And then we've got the consent banner, which we've obviously discussed at length already. But at a high level, testing language translations, like what does that really mean? And what's the strategy that we took and that we're continuing to take? We had to make a decision up front. Were we going to throw a bunch of different QA engineers at this to test manually, or are we going to go for a more technical solution? But really, it's automated testing first. And it was important for us to make that decision right up front and say to ourselves, hey, we want to test at scale. We need to implement a scalable automated testing framework with continuous integration and ultimately browser coverage across different versions of Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and different versions of mobile browsers as well. Another fundamental building block was segmenting the banner and the cookie drawer elements by HTML text and component, similar to what I highlighted a bit earlier, right? We can't just treat a consent banner or a storage preferences drawer as a single element. We need to break that down. So that way, when we pull it into a test script, that we can easily import those JSON objects with those strings and different color combinations, for example, and assert against those. Which brings me into the next point. It sort of bleeds into this next point, like translating the HTML data into JSON. That really helps us not only visually see what we're going to be testing in terms of the key and value pairs, but it gives us an idea of why these translations are important and that we need coverage on them as well. And then thinking globally, right? It's easy to get caught up being a QA engineer or a QA professional and you're testing whatever you're testing on your own machine, but trying to step outside the box and understand, okay, how can we achieve the highest amount of confidence and reliability, not only in an efficient way, but in a way that makes sense for our team as well. So thinking globally is important, and it's challenging, but it's crucial to scaling quality as much as possible. And then there's also pre-consent and post-consent. So when you land on any type of web application that has a cookie consent solution, right? When you land on it and it's a clean browser session, there's where it's pre-consent, right? You have yet to consent to anything. Therefore, in order to get to the post-consent phase, you've either got to save or accept all cookies, or classify your preferences as you see fit. So there's pre-consent and there's post-consent, and that's sort of something that flows into a lot of different testing methodologies, right? There's before and after behavior. Very similar thing when we're testing consent translations. There's the language support component, which we've touched on, and then there's scalability, which ties into thinking globally as well. But let's sort of put all this together and break it down, right? We've got our consent banner, we've got the description, data storage policy link, all the different toggle options, marketing, personalization, analytics, save and accept all. This visually should illustrate for you what this actually means. So marketing, personalization, and analytics, ultimately there are scripts, cookies, or iframes that are classified beneath each of those buckets. There is a save button, which if you were to deselect all three of those options on the left-hand side via the toggles and you hit save, that's giving you a more strict experience on that website. And vice versa, if you accept all, that's what's called a more permissive experience on that website. So really what this is about is being transparent to the user as to what they're accepting or not accepting and consenting to. But sort of under the hood, there are scripts, iframes, and cookies classified beneath each of those buckets. And then similar with the storage preferences drawer. In fact, it's almost the same, with the exception that storage preferences is typically used after you've consented, and you can go in and update your options, but the same fundamentals apply, right? You've got your essential, your marketing, personalization, analytics options, and under the hood, those are tied back to scripts, cookies, and iframes. So while it might seem daunting and complicated, it can actually be simplified if you break it down and just understand that we're breaking apart a UI, and then beneath that UI, things are sort of classified into buckets anyway. So it makes your testing strategy a little bit more predictable as you're building out test cases and different types of test suites. And then it's similar, and it's really not any different if we're talking about a version of the banner, for a different part of the world. There's just an extra toggle called storage, different hyperlinks to click on for the user. But ultimately, once again, these are tied back to different classified, allowed, or blocked scripts. And when you accept, ultimately it leads to something like this, right? Opening up application and dev tools, and you can sort of see the different key and value pairs for the cookies and different scripts that have been consented to. But once again, really tying this back to globally, right? Scalability, and not necessarily in realizing that trying to test 42 languages every time we want to release something is probably not the most efficient way to be doing this. So we're trying to focus on testing translations and languages for cookie consent as fast as we possibly can and as efficiently as we possibly can. So let's dive into this is the exciting part for me, diving into some examples and how in general do we set up the framework. A framework like Cypress, based on JavaScript, which is obviously popular, we use the fixtures, the integration directories, and those are required and they're built into Cypress. The fixtures are used to basically set up some of our data and to pull in the different JSON files based on the country that's being tested against. Then we have our integration directory. That's where we hold all of our spec files for all of the different classification options, and that's ultimately what we call into to run our tests. But what's sort of unique is that we have a locale file, and it uses basic JSON. There's nothing really special about it, but that's important to have all of the necessary strings that we need to test against different countries and different languages. So setting up a test. All right, so basically what this means is starting out, when I'm setting up a test script, we have our base URL with Cypress, and they have a built-in method and function you can use that you set in a Cypress JSON file to ultimately load up the URL that you're looking for. So that's pretty self-explanatory, but the catch with testing against different languages, we're trying to actually load a different version of the banner over 42 different times for a certain spec or configuration that we're testing against. So it's actually really important, and the test suite would completely fail if we did not clear our local storage and clear our cookies before each test run. So using before each in Cypress, they have built-in methods for you to actually clear this local storage and clear cookies. So you don't have to run into any weird conditions where you run a suite against English, for example, it's going to break down the test, but then you want to run a test against Spanish, you want to clear out that storage, clear out that browser storage, so you're dealing with a clean test case. Well, let's talk about JSON. This is actually, I love JSON. I don't know why. It's super powerful, given that it's really so simple, and it pairs really well with JavaScript and something like Cypress as well. But I've been talking about it quite a bit in terms of putting our strings that we're ultimately going to test against into a JSON file, right? So you remember the accept button, that's tied back to a key value pair in a JSON file. The essential categories option that we're using to classify, we're looking for the essential text within that element itself. So that's tied to a key value pair. And then we might have the data privacy by Osano hyperlink and cookie preferences. So really, to simplify this, everything that was in the banner that we looked at previously is, at least every piece of text is tied back to a JSON file, which we put into that locale directory for each country code that we're ultimately going to test against. And then as an example, we would have a different JSON file. This is Spanish, or a different version of Spanish. So we'd have a JSON file. It really has the same exact values, they're just in a different language. So once again, we can be predictable. And I'll dive into a specific example here of what I'm referencing. So here's an example of a function written in Cypress that's calling in to the English language, right? So we go back and we look at key value for accept, right? And we go look in the actual function language, and we're calling the first country in an array that we're loading in. In this case, we'll assume that that first country is English, and then we're calling key.value, right, for something called default. And default might just be the primary description in the cookie drawer. So we're using native Cypress functions, .contains, and then we're using the built-in .should assertions to ultimately check against what we have in those JSON files. And it's not showing in this example, but we're importing that locale directory with all of the different countries. So it would be the same exact thing if you were loading the second country. We would just create a separate function that was export function. Maybe it's ES for Spanish, and we just swap out the 0 option for the second option in whatever the country array is. So this is an example of us looking through all of the text, the buttons, the different classification options in a cookie consent banner. So then comes another fun part is running the test, right? Any of you that have written automation, this is like, it's the exciting part because you get to actually see the work that you've been working on, trying to get tests running and things like that. But I love writing these spec files because it just feels like we finally met one of our goals. But an example of a spec file that I might use to test cookie consent is we're importing the different countries that we want from a certain directory or path, and we're importing the countries as well. And that's basically the countries that we're passing into the URL to ultimately load things up and test against. But we're using a normal describe and it blocks, and then we're visiting the different variations and combinations that we have set up on a local web server. And then once we visit, we can run against a specific function like en. So we can call en inside this it block beneath side.visit, and it will execute. And another cool thing about Cypress and really browsers in general is that, as many of you probably know, you can see, if you go into like Chrome DevTools and you look in console, you can see all of the different functions that are loaded into a window. And in this case, there might be different regulations that expose a certain function and that we want to test that as well. Or we have a certain regulation that we need to test against. So Cypress has a window function built in as well. And this will be an example of that, of us testing against a certain API call that is tied back to our cookie consent banner and what a user should expect to see. But then ultimately, we get to the point where all of our specs passed, and it's exciting, right? So as you can see, an hour and 12 minutes, over 3,600 test cases. That's not 3,600 different spec files. It's not 3,600 different, configurations or combinations, but we've covered a lot of ground over all the different languages in a relatively short amount of time, in something that would probably take days to manually test. So I actually wanted to show you a video of the end result. So it's not just me showing you screenshots and talking about it. So this is using Cypress, and one reason why I think it's so cool, it's very visual, but as you can see, we're loading up over on the left-hand side. You can see the combinations in the different countries that we're loading up, and we can see that we're loading banners and we're loading the cookie preferences options and all the assertions on the left-hand side. This is an example. It's a very vanilla test page. Obviously, there's nothing on it, but sort of a proof of concept that everything that was discussed earlier and all the examples and the fundamentals, it can be applied, right? And given a framework like Cypress, it can really allow you to scale at a really high level. So I just think it's really cool to look at all of the different languages pop up one after another. I think it's pretty neat. So visually, this is what it might look like, right? And some of you who've used Cypress have seen this, but this would be an example for English, but we're just getting different elements in the HTML. And then inside, if you look at these contained sections of this example results section here, instead of really what we're swapping out is the different language versions of essential and marketing and personalization and things like that. So just sort of another proof of concept. So to kind of wrap things up here, some general lessons learned. I didn't want to have a slide with like 10 or 15 different things, but I think it was important for us to embrace modern tools. And I think it's important for QA engineering in general. Embrace modern tools, right? We've got a lot of different great frameworks out there. There's open source solutions for continuous integration like Jenkins, right? And there's just a lot of things that we can use with Node and things that are built on top of JavaScript to help our testing lives become more efficient and to help us become better problem solvers as well in the QA profession. So embracing modern tools is really important. Then the other one is that scalability leads to confidence ultimately. We run a lot of these tests on a nightly regression test run. We can also run them on demand. But I can't tell you how good it makes me feel just coming to work in the morning knowing that we ran, thousands of different tests in a relatively short amount of time and really didn't have to do much work, right? We already put all of the work in. So embracing modern tools, scalability leads to confidence. Because ultimately quality, what it really is, in my opinion, is a combination of confidence and efficiency that's leads to a better business outcome for our users and customers. So this is one way that we're still learning and growing on, but just shows the importance of committing to an automated testing first solution, simplifying the problem, and then ultimately getting a solution in place for it. So once again, it's been a pleasure. Thank you to James. Thank you to Software Test Professionals for having me. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Got the URL on the slide here. I'm more than happy to chat about QA and data privacy in general and testing and anything between. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan. That was a great presentation. It looks like we do have one question. I'll give some time for some more to roll in here, but what are the biggest mistakes companies make when it comes to cookie consent? How do you address them at Osano?
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. I think that it's important to realize that data privacy is becoming a lot bigger. I think we're all aware of, different tracking mechanisms and a lot of the analytics that might be tracking our moves on different websites. I just think it's important for trust, and it's important for the trust and building that with your users when they land on, a different website, or just really giving them the power and giving them the flexibility to decide what kind of experience they might want to have. But ultimately, it's also about providing transparency. And at Osano, we are big on helping our customers as much as we can and providing them with the knowledge that they might need to understand that. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions on that. But ultimately, we're trying to make this more transparent and provide a great solution as well along the way.
Perfect, great answer. It looks like that's all we have for today as far as questions. Do you have anything more you want to add on to it? Anything else you guys have coming up for Osano that you might be big or upcoming?
Nothing specific. I would encourage you to go to osano.com and to check it out. If you have any more specific questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm more than happy to either answer them or point you in the right direction.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. We enjoyed having you today. It was a great presentation. And like I said, I hope we see you hopefully in person soon.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Before we go today, a couple reminders. Coming this summer, the Mile High Software Testing Conference in Denver, Colorado. The 2-day in-person event will take place on July 27th and 28th. And we'll be covering all things software testing. Check out the workshop sessions and track talks confirmed so far. And register at milehighTesting.com. And join us for Thomas Haver's workshop, How to Build a Successful Automation Framework with BDD in Mind, and learn how to write automated scenarios, handle test data, implement continuous integration, and much, much more. The 2-day virtual workshop is on June 9th next week and June 16th. And you can register at SoftwareTestPro.com today. Also, be sure to check out the virtual workshop Essential Patterns of Mature Agile Testers from Bob Galen and Sean Bradshaw, exploring the characteristics of strong Agile testers and helping you guide your team to higher performance. Visit SoftwareTestPro.com today. And lastly, our next scheduled webinar will take place on June 30th. Vishnu Murthy will be giving a presentation on distributed workload generator testing and how you can use emerging technologies. Visit SoftwareTestPro.com to sign up for this webinar and view all the upcoming webinars from STP in 2021. And with that, thank you, Ryan. We enjoyed having you as always. And thank you for everyone who attended the webinar today. Have a great day. Stay safe.